They and I all met in South Africa. Sana and I were in a panel covering migration. I always seem to be on panels discussing migration, which is, of course, my beat and something I love doing. And Sana and Geisha got in touch with me and said that they had seen this report from Europol in 2016, which said that 10,000 child migrants had disappeared in Europe, and nobody knew what happened to them. Where did these children go? And it just was quite a startling statistic, and it was just a news item. And Sana and Geisha got together along with Cecilia Ferrara, an Italian journalist based in Rome, and we set up Lost in Europe, and we were fortunate to be awarded the Investigative Journalism for the EU grant, the first one back in 2018, and that's how we began. And now we're a team of about 23 journalists in 10 European countries, representing various media, El Mundo, Domani here in Italy, we have AFGI in Greece, we have Argos and VPRO in the Netherlands, De NAC and De Standard in Belgium, Guardian, BBC, and so on. And really, it's a cross-border collaboration of investigative reporters that are trying to figure out what has happened to these child migrants that have disappeared. Many of them, obviously, we know from the investigations that we've done, end up in criminal networks where they're exploited. You know, we've also been trying to work in a different way, which is trying to do long-term reporting on migration, but from a trauma-informed lens. So I'm very happy to say that Sana and I, and also Rosa Meneses, who's also here at the festival from El Mundo, have all done fellowships at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma in New York. So we're really interested in trying to tell stories of migration because they concern children, and doing it in a way which is ethically rooted and sound and proper. And we've done a lot of investigations, and I'll just mention a couple of brief ones. The first one I'll mention is an investigation we did in 2019 about Vietnamese children in Europe and what happens to them. We know that Vietnamese children have been trafficked for many years into Europe, often going on quite extraordinary journeys from Vietnam, sometimes via Russia, via China, ending up in Eastern Europe, and then they get to the Netherlands, where we started an investigation with Sana and others. And what we discovered was that 60 Vietnamese children had disappeared over a 5-year period in the Netherlands from shelters that were there to protect them. And we follow that lead with our reporters in Belgium and into the UK. And for that investigation, we won the Investigative Journalism for Europe award last year. Another investigation that I'll briefly mention, I'm sure we'll have more of a conversation about all these issues later on in the panel, but is last year sometimes, you know, we're doing investigations on particular topics, whether it's Vietnamese children, whether it's the trafficking of Nigerian girls, many different facets of the migration beat across Europe. But there are times where we can't do investigations simply with sources and stories, so you have to look at it from a different perspective. So in this case, we work with Adriana Homolova, who's a Slovakian journalist based in the Netherlands and one of our data reporters, and she spent 2019 and 20 putting freedom of information requests to almost every country in Europe. The only countries that did not come back to her request were the UK and France, I believe. And she asked them if they had the numbers for unaccompanied minors that were in their care, but then had disappeared. And what she found, and then we collaborated as this cross-border team, we discovered that between 2018, 2020, 18,000 child migrants had disappeared in Europe, and nobody knew what happened to them. So this gives you a flavor of the kind of collaborations we do. The other thing I also wanted to say is that we are really trying to work in a different way, not just in terms of doing, you know, the bread and butter investigative reporting, you know, getting into a story, getting into a location and digging into something, but also trying to work in a different way in terms of using methodology. So we think about this in terms of new modes of investigative journalism. So for example, we try to collaborate across different sectors. So we collaborate with artists, graphic journalists, obviously photographers, and also we work within communities. And one example I can give is we've worked with Tania Burguera, the Cuban artist, during her Tate Modern showing in 2018. We've also worked with Dan Archer to take some of the stories that we've done and turn them into comics. I'm sure you can see some slides coming up. And really, this is, trying to tell these urgent stories that is happening, that are happening across Europe, but in a more informed, humane way. And I suppose the panel, the ad, you saw the ad which said it's covering migration in the age of populism. So I think we'll pick that up. But really, it's thinking about the ways in which this beat has been covered often as a reporter who's been doing these stories all across Europe, particularly often in Italy. I've seen there's been a lot of negativity, there's been a lot of violence at the border, and of course we have the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, which I know you've both just been in, but I'm sure we'll pick these things up a bit later on, but that's probably enough for now.
Thank you, Ismail. So when we were preparing this panel, we were discussing how we could present the research that we are working on in a way that we can learn how we can do or try to fight the hate speech in internet, even in the media. And we were discussing about some basic things that probably all of us know, like which word we should use, respect. And today, when I was listening Fatima Hosseini, the Afghan photographer that was in the previous panel, she mentioned that she, as a photojournalist, she was covering some war issues and she was interviewing some families, but she never thought how sometimes the media and the reporters can be so harmful for the people that we are covering. And she explained that the day of the evacuation, when she left Afghanistan, all the photographers were taking photos in the airport, taking photos of her face. She was very worried because she didn't know how to leave the country. She didn't know what she's going to go. And that day she understood that sometimes even we are doing our job, respect is something that we really need to think before. We are talking not with victims or with interviewees. We are telling the stories of people. And sometimes it's much important to talk about the policies that we have in our countries, to talk about the context that these people have. Nobody likes to flee their houses. We saw this in Ukraine, and I think, and probably everybody agrees that the coverage that media we are doing in Ukraine is very different than we did in other situations. So understanding that it can happen to all of us, maybe it's a way to see migration like people that have to move and not just a problem, because we usually tend to cover it as a victim or as a problem. And sometimes it's not white and black, it's almost gray. So this is why we decided to talk about these three projects. And I will mention quickly about a project that we did in Outriders. Just a second if I find it here. Yeah. Okay, so it's here. So, yeah, I would like to see the slides. Yeah. So 3 or 4 months ago, probably all of you remember the coverage that all the media started to do in the border in Poland, because some people, usually families with children from Middle East, were arriving to Poland via Belarus. So for many days we were seeing photos of people in a forest, like they are trying to enter in Europe. And since in Outriders we we are an organization based in Poland, we knew that we have to cover it, but we didn't want to cover it in this way because firstly we thought that all the media were doing it, and because we wasn't sure that we are going to add something to the debate. So we decided for 10 days, almost the whole team, we were 10 journalists, we traveled to 7 countries, and firstly we decided to see what was really happening, who were the people that they were arriving, why, how they were getting the visas, why it was so easy. So we traveled to Lebanon, to Germany, to Belarus, to Dubai, to the airport, to Turkey. It was very interesting because suddenly almost the whole team was in different countries. So we created a WhatsApp group, Happy Birthday, so because we were afraid that in Minsk or in Dubai to send in some photos. So we were sending all the things that we found to this channel on WhatsApp. And in my case, I went to Lebanon. And it was very interesting because in a refugee camp in Bekaa Valley, like 1 hour from Beirut, when we talk about this situation that was happening, several families knew that it was very easy to go to Belarus. And you wonder why you want to go to Belarus, why maybe you are able to enter, but maybe you stay in a forest with temperatures -0. And I remember one of the guys that we can see here with his mother. He is from Syria. He arrived to Lebanon 10 years before, and he couldn't study in Lebanon. He sometimes has some jobs, sometimes he doesn't. And he was thinking, okay, I don't have anything to lose. And the thing with this is like now when we were last week in Lviv, in the western part of Ukraine, and we listen in very similar stories of people who think that they are going to leave their house maybe for some weeks or for some months. And suddenly I remember the story of this family, and they told me that when they flee Syria, they always thought that it would be 1 month, 2 months, but they stay 10 years in a refugee camp. So sometimes it's very important to understand that really nobody wants to flee their houses. And when someone tries a different thing, it's because maybe they spent 10 years in a refugee camp and they think, I don't have anything to lose. Another of the families that we interviewed, he had a child with disabilities, and he tried with many NGOs to get that his child was treated, but he couldn't. And he explained me in the interview that he wanted to go to Europe because he knew that there his child would be treated. And firstly, I was thinking that probably not. That maybe even if you go there, you are not going to see your child anymore. But the thing is, since we don't cover these stories, we just cover people that they are arriving to our continent or our country, we are not able to understand that. And we don't explain the policies. We don't explain why sometimes it's so difficult, even you are living in a country, to get a job or to study. There are people who were studying in Syria, and now they are not able to study anymore, or in Lebanon. Another family that we interviewed in Beirut, the children had a normal life in Syria when they left 10 years ago. Now they are not attending a school. When someone flee a country and they try to enter in Europe, sometimes it's because they want that their children go to a school. So this is why it's so important to cover all the process. And in this case, well, we were in 7 countries. This is in the airport in Istanbul. Most of the people who were traveling those days or months, they were young people in their 20s because firstly they think that they are going to have more opportunities, or maybe the parents think that it's not more their opportunity. And we were in Lithuania also. So now, when we covered this some months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, and now we see how media are covering all the studies about refugees in Ukraine, we see that, of course, there is a way to do it different. Sometimes it's because we don't want. If we explain the reasons, if we treat each one as people, not as numbers, not as victims, like we are doing in Ukraine, it will be easier to fight with the hate speech. And Elvira collected some information about how media in Greece are covering migration and how sometimes we are creating a problem when there is not a problem.
For example, here in these pictures, okay, it's in Greek. I gathered some media incidents from Greek press. You can see some pictures like the woman, which is a fake picture to accompany an article about the position of women in Islam. So I will start differently, saying I wanted to speak a little bit about Ukraine, but I will start from here now, about the main narratives in Greek media that have to do with the Great Replacement. Maybe you are familiar with the theory of Great Replacement. If you are not, this is a theory that well presented in European media as well, like in France. It's very popular in France. For example, like the Muslims, their target is to come to Europe and replace the population by giving birth to many children, by trying to bring Islam to get benefited from European policies of integration and then bring Islam to Europe. This is a concept that is, if you look at numbers, it can be easily debunked, but it's something that they like to promote in Greek media. And it doesn't come, and this is in the interesting part, from people, from representatives of the far right. It comes from legit writers, legitimate writers. The concept of how Islam, like for example, here is the title saying it's Islam compatible with democracy. Islam cannot be Europe. It's a barbarian thing. What can we do with Islam? We have to save the West. This is the responsibility of our generation. That was some titles. Before I go to Yannis, I will just tell you that this concept of the Great Replacement is really evident in Greek media. And the fear of Islamization, it's accompanied with misinformation. One of my favorites is that now in the streets of Athens, there is a group of extreme Muslims trying to implement Sharia, and whoever doesn't follow their rules, they beat them up and they make them, which is nonsense. We did a report about that. I interviewed the police, I called the police, I asked, is there anything like that happening in the streets of Athens? Of course, nothing of this is happening, but this is reproduced in Greek media by legitimate writers. So this is one of the main narratives, the main stereotype about refugees. We have a problem with Islam, and particularly we have it because we are neighbors to Turkey, and Greek-Turkish relations are not really good, like for the last 5 centuries. So, we consider the Ottoman, the Muslim element really problematic. But the good thing now, the good representation, which is also problematic, is this one. This is Yannis Antetokounmpo. He's the Greek freak. Maybe if you know from, he's NBA champion. He plays with Milwaukee Bucks. He comes from Greece. Actually, he comes from Nigeria. But he was born in Greece. He was raised there, and he wouldn't get the Greek citizenship until we discovered he's really great. So when we decided that he's a talented basketball player, he was granted the citizenship, and he traveled to the US to make Greece proud. He grew up in poverty without basic rights, like every child that is that the parents were immigrants, that it was raised, despite be raised in Greek and attending the Greek school, they don't have, like if you're average, like if it was me, that I was not born by Greek parents, like I'm short, definitely not for basketball, I wouldn't get the Greek citizenship ever. So if you're tall and very good player, and really talented as he is, I really like him, by the way, he's my hero. Yeah, things are easier. But the way you're represented in the media has something very Greek with you. Like, for example, do we have the other picture of the student? No. Anyway, lately we had a child from, he came in Greece as a minor from Africa as well. No parents, no anyone. He attended Greek school. His name is Saidu, and he participated in the Greek parade. By the way, in Greece, students, they participate in a parade twice a year in the national celebration, in our national days, which is also probably weird. And we had pictures of Saidu, who is black, in the parade, and he was embraced by other attendants of the parade, and his story is really touching because he studies, he wants to stay here, but at the same time he has to flee the country very soon because his permit is expiring. So there was a big protest in support of him, so he can manage to stay in Greece because he really likes it there. Again, we had to present Saidu inside the parade with the element of Greekness. I think when we embrace, when we report on the successful, the good stories, even when we report in the good stories of migrants and refugees in Greece, we have a tendency to underline the fact that they are proud of Greece. You cannot be it is as if you cannot be accepted if you're not proud of the country that gives you, provides you with a better future. And I think that reporting on migration stories must go beyond there. The migrants and refugees they don't have to be proud of any country in order to find a place in our stories or to be represented as they are. And not all of them are good and, cute and miracle, like Yannis and Saidu, for example. Maybe they are just average people, and this is okay. If you give them the elements of a real person and not make them look like giants in order to find a place on your reporting, I think this is a good direction. Now, what I saw in Ukraine, I didn't need to be in Ukraine to say that, is that there was a distinction, that some pictures we took there, people flee the war in Ukraine, particularly this one was in the hospital for cancer treatment. These were kids that were suffered from serious illnesses, and they were transferred to hospitals around Europe, also Greece, and that was very easily arranged between countries. Something that wouldn't maybe happen for other refugees. The Minister of Migration, the Greek Minister of Migration said, amid other things, that the Ukrainians are the real refugees. That was an official statement. And of course they are real refugees, they flee from war. But that doesn't make other refugees that flee from other wars in other geographies less refugees than them. And he was asked, he explained why he's saying that, because the European Union had granted them automatically asylum, the refugee characterization, so for all of them, from the 100% of them, and authorities in Greece believe that we have this problem that 70% of people who cross our borders, and despite saying they are refugees, they are not. They are migrant, economic migrants, or they come here for other reasons. So they really need to find a distinction to underline this distinction between the real refugees, that are only people who flee from war, and the others who are not, and maybe they shouldn't be granted any liberties in Greek territory or in European territories. I get this point. I mean, I don't want, we all have our biases. I have mine as well. I believe I don't really care what is the reason that you leave a country if you find there is a necessity and an urgent need to fly far, because no one really wants to leave their house and their people. I think this is a common human element. No one wants to go far, very far. So I think also that poverty is a kind of war. But that's my own views. When we report on them, on migration, I always take into account this stuff, but these are not important to others, to the readers. And my idea, like when I'm thinking how can we report on migration without bringing all of our biases in our reporting, is I don't have an answer. What I believe it could be really helpful is if in our media we would have we had diversity, professionals that come from these countries. And I don't mean just because we tried this in the past, and I have seen this happening in some Greek independent media, not refugees and migrants that are just invited there to be trained and work as refugees. For example, there is a very nice initiative from refugee teenagers. They make a newspaper, they called it Migratory Birds. They're minors and they produce their own content, but they're not professionals. They're not professional journalists. And what I believe it's missing from the media landscape, it's professional journalists doing this work and be able to report for matters that they know better in a professional and journalistic way, not as citizen journalists, not as just refugees, but as professionals. And I think this is a tip for Greek media if they wanted to solve or trying to solve this problem.
In your case, Ismail, did you see any changes in the United Kingdom in the last years with political parties using migration as a tool for their benefits?
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's exactly what Elvira was outlining. Particularly since the so-called migrant crisis of 2015, we saw the representations of refugees and migrants in the European media, in whichever country you happen to be in, fit this extreme binary, either as a victim or as a threat. Refugees and migrants are represented in. You also were talking about the kind of language that is used when it comes to talking about this issue in the newspapers. For example, you could easily have read in the UK press when the sort of so-called crisis was happening in 2015. Very routinely, people would, journalists, newspapers would describe what was going on in terms of kind of flood, in terms of swarm. So these kind of, linguistic kind of tools, which is really to give this impression that somehow Europe was being overwhelmed, drowned. And this is, of course, rooted in deeply racist, problematic histories, which go a long way back, which I'll come to briefly. But I think the point about a lot of this stuff is that, the media itself, media landscape, particularly in Britain, I can speak of, is deeply not equipped to deal with these issues, because if you look at the question of representation in the British media, it's overwhelmingly white, it's middle class, it doesn't look like or sound like the people that it's claiming to serve or the stories that it's claiming to report about. So there is a deficit of actually understanding at the level of the editorial decision-making that's happening, understanding what kind of language to be used, how to describe people, how to approach the storytelling, and how to actually engage with communities. And I think often what's happening is that what Elvira was saying in Greece is a really interesting example from Greece, that, the fallback when it comes to covering refugees and migration is often just base Islamophobia. You were mentioning these kind of extremist ideas, which are very much rooted in the far right. and rooted in this populist far-right use of migration as a weapon, because it was a vote winner. And particularly in the UK, when Brexit was happening, you saw UKIP, who campaigned for Brexit, and Nigel Farage's former party, using images of refugees crossing the borders in Europe, saying breaking point. And that was, sending a very clear message, or giving us this fear that if the UK didn't leave the European Union, that somehow millions of Turks were going to imminently join the European Union. None, of course, which is true. And the other point about all of this is, we're now here with the situation in the Ukraine, and I don't cover the Ukraine, but I've been following the news, and it's just been remarkable, but not surprising, right? We've seen, reporters say, they look like us, they live like us, they're civilized. I mean, we know what this comes from. It comes from a deep place of racism. And it was interesting because there was a correspondent from CBS News in the United States, who said, these people are civilized. And he was referring to Syria. And I thought, God, you don't know your history. Civilization was invented in Syria. So, this comes from a very deep place. And I spend a lot of my time in Italy, and I'll just mention a couple of brief points, because I think it's really important, whilst it's really appropriate to have the outpouring solidarity and compassion for the crisis in the Ukraine, and there are actually questions whether the response is good enough even, that compassion and solidarity has to also be spread a bit to other people who are rightly seeking refuge from violence and from conflicts, often which European countries have very much been the maid to, very much been involved in. Particularly my country in the UK has been overly involved in the world and has, its foreign policy caused a lot of ruckus and a lot of problems. And, people don't make these kind of connections. So you have this idea that if you're reading a newspaper article in England somewhere, and then you see the headline, you think, oh God, these people, they're coming, where are they coming from, why are they coming? No context. And this is one of the problems in the news media when it comes to migration. We don't really give context. And a lot of this stuff, I was just listening to Elvira's, contribution, which is really amazing to listen to. And I was just thinking, a lot of this stuff is about the public sphere. It's about, the national public sphere here in Italy or in Greece or in the UK or the European level, and it's about whose stories do we listen to, whose voices matter, who's visible and who's invincible. And I think it's the job of investigative journalists particularly to put a mirror to society and to say, look, there are thousands of unaccompanied child migrants that are missing, that have been abused. There are things happening in the internal borders in the EU. The police are not doing their job. I've just finished up this big investigation from Sicily, which just published for the BBC last week, looking at the criminalization of migrant boat drivers. In the last decade, Italy has arrested almost 2,500 people, according to a report by a Palermo-based NGO, Arci Rosso, an alarm phone, accusing them under Article 12 of the Italian Penal Code for abetting illegal immigration. But a lot of these people that are arrested are minors. They're people who are arrested on very weak evidence, unreliable witnesses. I investigated in Palermo, and I spoke to people who said that the police routinely in Italy, when migrants land, offer migrants documents, migration documents, in exchange for them giving testimony against alleged boat drivers. And I came across cases of minors that were tried as adults and put in prison. And the story that I did for the BBC really delves into this story of a young man from Senegal. He was 16 years old when he landed in Sicily. He was immediately taken to a police cell. He didn't know this. And then he was taken to what he thought was a reception center in Trapani. But it turned out that it was a prison, and he only found out 2 days into his stay. He was kept in prison for 9 months without the right to call his family. He spent almost 2 years in prison, and when he eventually, his lawyer got him an appeal hearing in Palermo, in 2017, he went into the tribunale for minors, and the judge walked out of the room and said, I can't preside over this case because this kid is clearly a minor. And his case hasn't been dealt with because his case has been sent back from that court to the Court of Minors in Palermo, and he's still 6 years later waiting for the outcome. And I've been digging into this one story of many forms of injustice that are happening, and I managed to get information from the Ministry of Justice in Italy. It took a while, but they did come back to me, and they said to me, actually this is what they said, as of the 22nd of March, that there are 952 inmates, of which 562 were convicted on people smuggling charges in Italy. I put a lot of points to the Ministry of Justice here, and I said there are accusations that minors are being tried as adults, the police are engaging in corrupt mechanisms, that there's evidence that it's been used against wrong people, unreliable witnesses, that the people who've been accused of people smuggling for driving boats, often because they have to, because they've got no choice, because they're saving lives at sea, are forced to confessions in some cases I've heard, and they haven't come back to me. And I want to end on this point, which is the violence of the EU border system. We haven't really mentioned that. We need to think very clearly about that and put this to the European Union and what is happening, and the fact that they let migrants die in the Mediterranean, have done, as a way to stop others from coming. It hasn't worked. And we have the violence also of the EU pushbacks that are happening. And in Lost in Europe, we're looking into the internal pushbacks within the borders in Europe as well, and also what they're doing in Libya and even in places like Niger. So whilst we talk about, rightfully, the things that the media gets wrong when it comes to reporting on migration, we also have to talk about state violence, and particularly the violence at the EU level, and the fact that that's killing people.
I would like to highlight a couple of things that you said. One, how important is the vocabulary. I don't know if in the case of UK or in the case of Greece, you have a word to refer to children who come from a migrant background, but in Spanish we say mena. So it's very interesting how when we are talking about children, in very few occasions you read the word children. And I think it's something that is very different right now covering Ukraine, because you say that children with mothers and families are leaving a country, but it's something that is happening with many countries. But since we don't use the word child or children, it's very difficult for the reader that they understand they are a child or they are a children. They are a MENA, and it's a very different thing. And I would like to highlight also that you talk about how important is representation. Mm-hmm. I know that you have edited a book about representation of migration in Europe, and I would like before to go quickly to an example in Spain that I think is very interesting. It's an organization that I'm not sure if they are in the festival this year, Por Causa, and they created with some Syrian journalists a newspaper in Arabic and in Spanish. And because sometimes we tend to think that because you are from a migrant background or a refugee background, you need to write always about migration. I remember that a journalist from Syria, told me some months ago, I don't know when I'm going to be a journalist again, and I'm going to not be a refugee, because when she was in Syria, she was a journalist. And now when she is in Berlin, she's not a journalist anymore. She's a refugee who works as a journalist. And how important is representation, but not always to cover migration. And this case of Por Causa and Bayana, who is the name of the organization, the media, I remember that they cover a very interesting topic with different eyes, because they arrived to Spain and they realized how many elderly and old people are living in nursery homes. And for them, it was shocking, because it's like in our country, most of the grandparents stay at home with us. And they covered this story maybe with a naive perspective, but you learn also how when we put on the table different eyes, different countries, different backgrounds, we can get also different stories. We don't need only a journalist with a refugee background to talk about refugees. Maybe they can talk about elderly people in Spain.
Yeah.
And I would like that you tell us a little bit about this book that you have edited.
Thank you. Yes, they can write about food, agriculture. We need a diversity of people. We need diversity of content, a diversity of opinion, because it's good for the news industry. It's good for the media. And it always seems on these panels we make these points and very little often changes. So the book that you were mentioning, Lola, is called Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives in the Public Sphere. It was published in 2019, and it's a collection of essays which looks at the representations of refugees and migrants in the European media. And there's a few essays I'll mention by our contributors. So one of them is by Daniel Trilling, who's a columnist of The Guardian, author. And actually his essay from the contribution has been republished as a Guardian long read. And that contribution is all about the ways in which the media represented and covered the so-called migrant crisis 2015. It's a really helpful essay. It's available. You can read it online. Another piece which I thought was fabulous is by Eche Temulkeren. I'm sure many of you know, who's fabulous, wonderful human being, and she wrote a really moving piece for the collection about the idea of being in exile and what it feels at an emotional level, because we've heard this as well. Nobody wants to leave their home. Nobody wants to give up the comforts of home. Violence, conflict, poverty, foreign policy of European states often drives people to make these journeys. And another piece also from the collection is by Nesreen Malik, who's at The Guardian as well, and she writes about this idea of humanizing migrants, that you were mentioning this before, that in the attempt, especially, you said the project you were mentioning in Spain was a bit naive, because sometimes we want to do good, so we want to give the tools back to refugees and migrants and tell good stories, and we find a story, I don't know, it's somewhere in London, there's a guy from Syria who's got this amazing falafel truck, and he's just this perfect kind of refugee, or you mentioning the basketball player from Greece. The problem is that in the attempt to kind of humanize people, we can actually engage in dehumanizing tactics. People don't have to, as you said, be grateful for anything. If you're a refugee or a migrant, you don't have to cover, as a journalist that is, those issues. You can cover whatever you want. The point is we have to see the totality of someone's humanness and their quality. And I think a lot of that comes from really powerful histories of violence and the ways in which we depict the other. And it's interesting the context of the Ukraine, because I've mentioned, we've heard the coverage refer to people from the Ukraine as being similar. Now, you could say, yes, because it's in the continent of Europe and that there are cultural similarities. Of course, that makes sense. And the welcome and solidarity has been wonderful to see, and it's been very surprising from countries like Poland, which is famously, was very anti-migrant in the time of 2015 when all the Syrians were arriving. But at the same time, if you look at it also, Russia, which is so culturally close to Ukraine in many ways, also has gone to war. So this idea that we treat someone that looks like us better than someone who doesn't, I don't quite understand that. And I think a lot of it is just to do with fear of the other and of these racist histories that are very problematic. And I think they need to be really dealt with. And this is what Lost in Media, the book, was trying to delve with. And final thing I'd say is, I spend a lot of time in Italy, and a lot of the stories I cover are primarily in Sicily. And in this country, these histories are rarely reflected. If you look at the histories of colonialism, which virtually I have to say, very few Italians ever know anything about the colonial history in this country, and what happened, Very few know about the massacres that took place in Ethiopia. Very few know about the fact that Eni is involved in Libya. Very few people know how these histories of colonialism are deeply wired through the fascistic system that was Mussolini and the consequences for Italy after the Second World War. That was largely forgotten. People didn't talk about it. So, and Italy is just one example. You've got the UK, you've got a lot of other countries. The point is, these histories that are happening now and how we're covering these stories are not just from nowhere. They come from somewhere, and they're rooted in much deeper histories. And we can't really talk about this stuff unless we have a proper process of decolonizing and unlearning these kinds of things.
If you have the opportunity to go to the website of Lost in Europe, I really like the way that you explain the stories of children. And I would like to ask you, because they presented their stories in a way that it looks like you are chatting with them.
Yes.
So you are not reading the bio of someone. You are asking, where are you? Where are you from?
Yeah, exactly. It's to change the. Just keep it brief. But it's to change the lens, because the point is much of journalism is extractive. Like, it's going to an oil field and you just take the oil out and there you go. So the idea is to change the narrative, because they're children as well, to give them agency. So the chats are like, they ask a question, you get an answer, and it's really to change the way in which we tell these stories. And a lot of this stuff is also available. The Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, have a look at that center, do excellent work on doing this stuff in a really sensitive way, and a lot of the resources that we work with are from Dart as well. So,
yeah, in your case, I would like to ask you, Elvira, in Greece, there is a word to refer to children who leave their countries, or there is not? You call them children.
No, we call them with the adjective unaccompanied. Just that, the unaccompanied.
Very similar to MENA, I
yes.
think.
But I wanted to also stress the fact that in Greece we don't have words, no, we have, but we don't use them. Like the word pushbacks is not really often used in sublist media. Greek government thinks that there are no pushbacks, actually, despite the reports on the contrary about pushbacks. Once, like really recently, a lawyer in Samos told me when I interviewed him about a project of MIR, he said, well, I cannot say anything about what you're asking because there are no any more newcomers because they're all pushed back. So, I mean, this is also very problematic and we are not discussing it. There are walls that need to break while we are reporting. Of course, we are breaking. I mean, there are journalists, Greeks and from abroad, that they report on the stories, they publish these things. It's not that it's not that no one is talking about that. It would be greatest if we could talk more about these things in a way that would be engaging for the audience, because another problem is that the Greek audience, at least I know for the Greeks, sure, they are kind of tired listening and reading about refugee stories since 2015, that the big influx began. But also I wanted to say something else that Ismail and you, Lola, mentioned about, about the refugees that are also journalists, that we ask them to only report in, of course, because I mentioned something relevant before. My point of view is that for example, when we talk about Islam in Greece, we have, and there is a specific writer, every month I found an article of him about Islam, analyzing the same thing, how Islam in its core is barbaric and want to expand, and that's the ultimate goal of all Muslims around the world. So I'd really appreciate, as a reader, not as a journalist, and I say all this as a reader, I'm mostly a reader and then a journalist, to read a piece about Islam from someone who experienced Islam as a way of life, like who believes in Islam. I mean, I miss this kind of representation of people who know what they're talking about because they have experienced it from another position. I really love to see that. Pretty much, yeah, this is the problem with, at least I can speak for the Greek media, the problem of the Greekness, that we have to underline it everywhere when we want to say something good about refugees, and the problem of the absence of words like pushbacks and analysis of Islam, for example, when we get to report on the subjects.
And because I think that sometimes we don't need to say that everything is positive. And since I see Nina here from Solution Journalism, I think that maybe this is the path that journalists have to follow. It's not that we have to say that everything is amazing with the person, but maybe we can find the people and the organizations who really are doing something, that really we can learn from there. I know that there are many journalists, there are many organizations like both of you that they are trying to research and to investigate, and many can replicate that. Maybe we should focus more on that, because sometimes what we said, we try to be very good and to say, look at, we need to feel pity. Nobody wants that we feel pity of them. Maybe we need to learn which organizations, which countries, which towns are doing something good.
I think so. I think we need empathy and compassion, because empathy induces much better engagement than pity, because nobody wants pity. I think collaboration is key. In the Lost in Europe example, having journalists in multiple countries working on these issues, because they're cross-border in nature. When you're investigating trafficking gangs, missing children, and also solutions journalism, I think it's a really good way around that. And the idea is to not say this is a positive big story, is to sort of say something is working. And I often find one of the ways I've done stories around that is working with the people that are affected by the story. So I've spent a lot of time in Sicily working with trafficked Nigerian women. And a story that I did for the BBC a couple of years ago was I worked entirely with Osas Egbon, who runs Women of Benin City. She was a former prostitute trafficked into sexual slavery in Palermo 20 years ago. And she set up a foundation in Palermo to help rescue other girls. And what she did is she established the first shelter by and for Nigerian trafficked women in Italy, I believe, and it's in the mountains of Sicily. And she was hiding 5 women and a young girl who had fled a really horrible situation. And that story was changing the lens away from the victim and they've been taken from their country and something really horrible has happened to them, to something much more powerful, which is that she did something extraordinary and she used her pain, her experience, and everything she learned to help other people. So I think that's one way around this kind of too heavy victim, here's a problem, look at it, do something about it, to show people in a different way, in a more empathetic way in which they have agency and control over the story.
And I think for all of us, that most of we are journalists, I think it's our responsibility. We cannot just close the eyes and say how many hate speech there is on media. I know it's very difficult, and sometimes we need to find a way to cover it. I remember that yesterday I was talking with Ali from the Afghan panel, and he said that he's always worried to doesn't write an article that can affect someone in Afghanistan. So he changed the names, but he's always checking that nobody has this name, because maybe he's going to put someone in problem. Yeah. I think we need to, as a journalist, we have a responsibility. And when we write something amazing, we need to think how it's going to affect to the reader, to the society, because we can do something good too.
Yeah, we do. And just to say again, if everybody's interested, there's a lot of resources on the Dart Center I keep mentioning because it's fabulous for journalism and trauma, and there are lots of examples on how to cover children, trafficked women, all kinds of beats when it comes to journalism, but it's a really good resource if you want to think about, particularly when it comes to children. I'm very interested in young people, and I know Irene is here, who's a fantastic journalist who does a lot on this as well, so talk to her. But there's a lot of resources, so just go onto the DART website and check it all out.
I think we don't have time, but Elvira, if you want to say something to finish.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.